Okay, everybody. Hi there. I get to get us restarted. My name is Michael Homeier. I am one of the founding shareholders of Homeier Law, which is a securities, corporate, and transactional law firm based in Los Angeles. We are heavily involved in our securities practice in both investment crowdfunding and EB5 immigrant investor funding. Sydney asked me to join you to not only share some specifics about the EB5 program for those of you who don't know what it is or might be interested in learning a bit more about it, and I will be giving that additional detail to you, as well as in this PowerPoint presentation, which is available for those of you who would like it either from Sydney or from me directly. Just reach out by email. I'm not going to read the PowerPoint to you. Yay. You can do that fine on your own. I will touch on some of the points in a summary fashion, but I wanted to carve out a little bit of the time and talk to you about ways in which EB5 is connected to crowdfunding and can serve as an example, kind of as a precursor to seeing what investment crowdfunding can look forward to based on the example of EB5, which, as you may know, has been out and about for a much longer period of time than has crowdfunding. In fact, EB5 came into existence in 1990, and so we have got 26 years of experience. It is an increasingly regulated area of investment financing, and again, as I say, I think a lot of the lessons that we've learned through participation in EB5 are going to be informative for those of us working in the investment crowdfunding space. So, just a little bit of background about my firm and our experience. We are, as I said, a securities and corporate transactional firm. Our securities practice, we have been fortunate to work on over 500, we used to call them private offerings, but now I guess the better term is exempt offerings, in the last, well, in our 9-year history. I would say over 400 of those projects have been EB5 projects. The others have been private equity and conventional private equity and now, increasingly, investment crowdfunding. We are affiliated with Verify Investor, which is the accredited investor verification company many of you are familiar with. My law partner, Jor Law, founded that company because when Title II came down the road and the changes were made to Rule 506 of Reg D that we're going to require accredited investor as the quid pro quo to getting to advertise publicly, we didn't know where to send clients to make sure that they were getting verification done right, because the consequences of doing it wrong are fatal. So my partner Jor decided he would form a verification company, and his experience in doing that, I think, also is something that I'd like to share with you about, because I think it also is illuminative of where crowdfunding is and where it may be headed. Obviously, I'm speaking about a lot of our own experience, which is what I know the best. We're not the only firm doing EB5, just like we're not the only firm, securities firm involved on crowdfunding. But I can tell you we have been blessed to have a significant deal flow, which gives us the information that I wanted to share with you today. The EB5 program is the immigrant investor program, the 5th employment-based visa that the U.S. government gives. And it has been, as I say, around for 26 years. It was very much under the radar until the recession, 2008, 2009, and it exploded in popularity primarily because of the recession. It's a counter-cyclical investment tool, at least it was initially, spurred primarily by real estate developers, there they are again, who said, gee, I can't get money from the bank anymore. Where am I going to go to get financing? And they heard about this program that was under the radar for about 15 or 18 years, mostly being used to fund real estate development. And so they really have led the charge on the growth of EB5. So let me give you some statistics just to give you an idea of what this biggest little program you never heard of is actually contributing to the U.S. economy. There has been almost $19 billion raised since 2008 through the EB5 program. All of that money goes to fund U.S. businesses And those businesses, if they spend the money in ways that create new U.S. jobs, the immigrant gets a green card. That is the EB-5 program in a nutshell. You hear people saying that EB-5 is buying green cards. It's really not, unless you consider that the price for the green card is not money, as it is instead job creation. The job creation cannot include the immigrant or his family. These are American residents, citizens, who have to be put to work, 10 in number for every investor. So that means you can actually see this is a math-driven kind of program. $19 billion raised since 2008. $10 billion is currently sitting in escrow in the United States as immigrants are slowly going through an ever-delayed immigration process. Primary reason of the process for the delay in the processing is that the Immigration Service can't hire processors fast enough to keep up with the demand for EB-5 green cards. So there's a lot of money sitting in the queue waiting to come into the U.S. economy, start helping businesses do their business, and create additional jobs. It's estimated there was about $10 billion contributed to the U.S. GDP just in 2010 through 2013, the last year that we have statistics. $2 billion of tax revenue has been received primarily by the states in that same 2010 to 2013 period. There are, in that same period, 30,000 U.S. jobs being created per year as a result of EB-5 investment. Now, EB-5 is limited to 10,000 investors a year. Actually, I'm sorry, there are 10,000 visas available per year. I'm not going to go into too much of the gory detail, although my PowerPoint does. So you'll be able to see, if you have the chance to take a look at it, some of the detail about how the program functions. But I'm going to skip over some of that detail and allow you to pick it up on your own. But just think about all of this money coming in and all of these jobs being created and all of these businesses that are being funded. All of it, remember, is zero taxpayer expense. This is all immigrant investor money. The minimum investment required is $500,000 currently for a project that's located in an area of high unemployment. It is, after all, a jobs creation program from the perspective of the U.S. government. And I can tell you that about 2/3 of all of the money in EB-5 is going into real estate development. The other 1/3 is going into everything other than real estate development. And these are things ranging from oil drilling to wineries to manufacturing of electric cars, and yes, even film production, of course. There'd have to be movies in there somewhere. The investors can come from any country and any combination of countries. China is currently contributing about 80% of the immigrant investor base. There is a quota for each country within the 10,000 a year limit on visas. China has exceeded, or I shouldn't say that, it has met its, well, yes, it's exceeded its quota. Obviously, they don't allow more visas per year than are available, and what that means is people get in line, and they get rolled over into the next fiscal year, and the next fiscal year, and the next fiscal year. The typical period of time that EB-5 money is invested in a project is 5 years, unless the investors are coming from China, in which case it is now 6 or 7, and sometimes 8 years before those investors could be looking to exit the investment. They want two things: green card and return of their principal, typically with very low interest, which means the usual EB-5 cost of funds is 4 to 6%. Sometimes a little more, sometimes less, but the investor of that 4 to 6% is usually earning less than 1% per year. Remember, he's got his money deployed for 5 to 8 years. Why is he willing to accept such a paltry return? He's getting the green card for himself, his spouse, and the children, all of which count toward that 10,000 limit. And what that means is the investors are only, the actual investor whose money is going into the U.S. business and creating jobs is approximately 30 to 40% of the total 10,000 visas per year. As you can imagine, there's a lot of energy being invested on the part of the industry trying to get that number increased. There certainly is demand overseas for more visas, and not only from China. Some of you who are active in investment and play in the European playground know that there is significantly increased over the last 2 years, significantly increased interest among Europeans in investment immigration. And the EB-5 program is viewed as the most attractive program. So again, those of us in the EB-5 industry view this as, you know, low-hanging fruit we wish we could pluck. If only they increase the visa numbers, we'll be able to bring in more people, more money, and create more jobs. So the beyond the typical requirements of EB-5 in the sense of where do the investors come from, what do they invest their money into, it's important to keep in mind, I think, that beyond those unique qualifications or unique requirements of the EB-5 program, there is almost nothing else you need to do that's magical and mystical about EB-5 in order to have EB-5 money be part of your capital stack. So that means for a consumer of EB-5 dollars, again, 2/3 are real estate developers doing projects ranging from hospitality to assisted living facilities to, well, gee, really every classification of real estate project you can think of. Schools, churches, hospitals, multifamily, they're all attractive candidates for EB-5 money. But the developer is typically in the position of just receiving the dollars and deploying it into the project. Bless you. The EB-5 funding company is a separate company that actually goes overseas to raise the financing, bring it back, and deploy it into the U.S. business. That's the securities transaction. We work for the issuer, who is typically not the recipient of the EB-5 money. The issuer that we write the investment papers for is the company that raises the money and then loans it, typically, or occasionally makes an equity play of the money into the development entity or the business if it's not a real estate business. The point that I wanted to emphasize is there are a few EB-5 program-specific requirements that the issuer certainly has to follow because he needs to make sure that his project is set up in a way that it complies with the EB-5 program, and also that the EB-5 investors are going to receive their green cards. And beyond that, though, it is almost identical to a garden variety private equity raise, as if the money was coming from domestic sources in the United States, other than those few ways in which an EB-5 project has to add a couple of things, unique things. For example, the money is deployed for so long, 5 to 8 years, because it cannot be returned to the investor before the permanent green card decision is made. The permanent green card decision is based on the creation of jobs. They are projected at the beginning, and then the business needs to show that the jobs were in fact created as a result of the spend of the money. That's how the process works. There's very little, as I say, that the business receiving the money has to do differently, which means EB-5 plays really well with capital coming from other sources because EB-5 requires so little done differently in order to accommodate the EB-5 money. Other than, for example, the point that I was making to you that the money can't be returned too soon, or the EB-5 investors could be deemed to have withdrawn their investment, to not have it sustained in a job-creating activity, and therefore lose the green card. So we tell the developers, warning, you've got to keep this money for 5 to 8 years. Most businesses would rather repay money later than sooner, so that's often not a headache for those businesses that need to exit the money because they're doing a sale or a refinancing transaction, and that money needs to be repaid. There are methods that have come about to allow that, to hopefully comply with the EB-5 program's requirements without running afoul of the prohibitions. I won't ladle those details on you. Suffice to say, there are those kinds of few in number technical requirements. Beyond that, EB-5 requires very little that's different. Gene.
Can you show jobs, 10 jobs after 1 year and be done with it, or do you have to wait 5 years?
You have to wait until the jobs have to be required at the end, have to be created by the end of 2 years. So the jobs need to be, from the way the government interprets that, the jobs have to be in existence at the end of 2 years from the time that the investor gets his temporary or conditional green card. Because of the delays in the process, that usually ends up being approximately 5 years to 6 or 7 years. That means the money has to stay in that long, it can't be repaid to them, and the job creation confirmation for these investors to get the permanent green card is going to be delayed. You would think that would drive people away from the program. It doesn't. They're not happy about it. Sure, they'd wish it was faster. We all would. On the other hand, the program remains so much in desire that our biggest challenge is trying to increase the ceiling on green cards. Another statistic, just for perspective, I said there are 10,000 EB5 visas available, and that number includes both the investor and the family. So you're really talking about fewer investors. There is approximately 1 million people who come into the United States through legal immigration every year, and 1 million illegal, it's estimated. But if you think about that, what that means, we're talking about 10,000 through EB5 versus 1 million from all other sources of legal immigration. So it's really a drop in the bucket, although it has a significant economic impact. And until recently, when there seems to have been an increase in job creation, pretty much the only program that was actually creating jobs in the U.S. economy in significant numbers was, surprise, surprise, it was EB5. Yeah?
I'm curious as far as the process for someone who, because I've been reading more about this, but where does an investor, if someone's in China, is it through a law firm, or do they find out about it through their government or programs? And just, I have a few clients that are offering this as an investment into their business, and I'm fascinated by it, but I'm just curious where someone would find out, like, where does an investor go to be able to get the green card to invest their $1 million or whatever they're going to invest?
It's a great question. Two ways, inbound and outbound. There are folks overseas who hear about EB5 and are interested. They'll contact usually a U.S. immigration attorney, sometimes a securities lawyer or business lawyer, and ask, do you have projects, or do you know of projects that are open to taking investors? And if so, what are they? I might be interested in one if I can find one that I like. Remember, they're making an investment decision as well as an immigration decision. They are not willing to put their money into a project and kiss off the money. They want a project that will not only generate the jobs so they get the green cards, but have a reasonable chance, like any investment, of repaying their principal. That's what they're looking for. If you're looking for large, those are relatively few in number of people who are proactive enough to reach into the United States. So most U.S. businesses, or the funding companies we represent, go overseas, and they work through networks of agents, sometimes attorneys, sometimes accountants, sometimes family members and friends, or cultural associations, but usually it's through networks of foreign brokers who will take a U.S. project and sell it to their countrymen for a fee. Most of that 4 to 6%, which is the cost of EB5 funds, is going to pay broker fees in foreign countries to pay the folks who source the investors into the U.S. project. If you're doing a onesie-twosie, $500,000 or $1 million from two investors, you can look for inbound, you can talk to family and friends, you can do the triple F, you can crowdfund, you can market over the internet, as long as you comply with all the securities laws. If you're looking for, our largest project was the Sahara Casino redevelopment that was done for SLS a few years ago. The total EB5 raise was $400 million at $500,000 a person. That was 800 investors putting in that money, and that was about $1.2 billion total project size. To get hundreds of investors into a project, you have to go overseas. And these brokers make a lot of money, but then they'll generate scores or even hundreds of investors for big size projects.
Just last part of the question.
Yeah.
As far as it becomes a permanent, the green card, they can naturalize once they're here.
Yes, they get a yes, they.
Immigration status.
Yep.
As far as that, so it doesn't matter the time frame that it takes.
Correct. As long as they satisfy the legal requirement, including whatever the delay the government says, sorry, but you're stuck with the delay, it's a permanent green card, which means it's highly sought. It's not one that ends when the job ends. It's not one that goes away when school's over. People have to go home. This is a permanent green card, and it can be a stepping stone for citizenship for those who are interested in it. So again, these are factors, you bet. that make it highly desirable. How does it connect to crowdfunding? Well, it's a model for, I think, what is coming in the area of crowdfunding. When we got started in EB5, we would come to a conference. We would be lucky to see 30 people in the room in 2009. Now, conferences are typically pulling in 600, 700, 800 people. So much so that it's in a relatively short 8-year period of time, in our experience. We weren't involved in the first 20 years, but in the last 8 years, we have seen a huge explosion, a big, big spike in EB5 demand. It took, obviously, time for it to take off. But once it took off, when businesses realized they could get low-cost capital, and it was money that was available when other money was not, that really drove the explosion in EB5, and it's been a huge explosion. It has flatlined currently. The reason that it's flatlined is a price of our own success. There has been, as there is in every area of securities law and securities experience, fraud. People who are taking advantage of other people. It's been mentioned by others of the attorneys and speakers here earlier. Certainly been the case in EB5. You know it's going to be the case in crowdfunding. It has been the case in the area of investment since, I think, man was placed on the earth. Not just since the securities laws came into effect 85 years ago, because why did they come into effect? Fraud. So EB5 has been no different. The SEC says we have no special rules for the EB5 program. It's all the regular rules apply. Crowdfunding, you know it's the same thing. There aren't any special rules for crowdfunding except the special rules for crowdfunding. But beyond that, it's the same old game. Fraud is punishable. And I don't mean just putting businesses out of business. And the SEC has gotten heavily involved in EB5 since 2013 when the first major fraud case came down. Because that case is now 5 years old, we have seen it go through not only the investigative period, not only the civil enforcement period, which was a lawsuit brought by the SEC following an FBI investigation. That case was settled. It's the infamous Chicago Convention Center case some of you may have heard of. It was followed by a criminal indictment, and the developer, who was convicted of committing fraud on his investors in 2 ways. Not only did he not tell them everything that he was going to do, but those things that he did tell them that he was going to do, he didn't do. By the way, this sounds exotic. It is not. It's garden variety securities fraud. You see it all the time, both in EB5 and out. And I expect, sadly, we will see it in crowdfunding as well. He's in jail for 3 years, the federal penitentiary. That's how seriously the SEC says we take fraud in EB5. But again, it's just like fraud outside. It's treated the same way. I think we can expect to see not only law enforcement getting involved in crowdfunding, it tends to follow the growth of an industry, but the SEC is obviously watching crowdfunding and should be, and they have stepped in to stop a few people already. You may have read about. I don't think there have been criminal prosecutions yet, but they will follow. Usually they come after the civil enforcement action gets adjudicated. And I expect that the crowdfunding experience is going to be very much like EB5 in that regard as well, which again, remember, is very much like non-EB5, which is the prior history. We've seen, Bernie Madoff, Global Crossing, Enron, none of them were EB5, none of them were crowdfunding. And those are just a few examples of, you hate to say garden variety, but garden variety securities fraud. I mean, it's the kind of securities fraud that either bad people or people who can't avoid the temptation fall into in the area of investment. The other thing that I wanted to point out, though, is not that I would expect law enforcement to get involved in keeping the industry clean in crowdfunding, as it has in EB5. But I would also suggest to you, I think that because of that, the experience that the EB5 industry is now going through having to do with legislation and regulation is going to be a path that we in the crowdfunding industry may well and probably will see ourselves as the industry matures. What's happened is, with all the fraud and all the complaints and about EB5, what you end up finding is Congress has said, hey, this has got to stop. We've got to do something to cut back on the opportunities for bad guys to rip off well-meaning investors. And don't forget, these investors may be, at the time they make the investment, foreigners, but their entire goal is to become Americans through this process. So really, you know, the law, there's an interest in trying to protect our own, just as if they were domestic investors. And of course, crowdfunding without the international aspect is always domestic investors. And the government certainly wants to protect them. But what's happened in the EB5 industry is it used to be on a rolling extension. Every 3 years, they'd roll it over for another 3 years. Now, the industry has said, well, wait a minute. We got to clean up this industry. We're going to require in legislation that there be 2 different areas addressed. One of them is program integrity. There needs to be greater transparency in the EB5 industry so that government has the opportunity to watch everybody involved on the business industry side of EB5 to be giving greater information more often to investors and to the government, both the Immigration Service as well as SEC, so that people are watching what's going on and that hopefully the incidence of fraud will be cut back. Secondly, they are willing to make, the Congress has said, they're willing to make program enhancements to improve the program at the price of the adoption of the integrity provisions. And what the government has done, while this legislation has been in Congress and it has been stalled for like the last year and a half, it has unfortunately been attached to the budget, and as the budget has been extended and rolled over without actual substantive changes being made to the budget, changes are not happening to the EB5 program as well. That time is running out because Congress has said, primarily in the US Senate, but also certain congressmen, we're not going to extend the EB5 program again until we clean it up. Enough of this already. We've got to clean it up, and we will improve it, but first we got to clean it up, and we'll get to it when we get to it. Having said that, the extension, the termination date, the expiration date for EB5 was supposed to be April 28th. Instead, they kicked it over as part of the omnibus for the entire budget until it was supposed to be the end of the week. But of course, they went ahead and passed the extension through September 30, where they kicked the can down the road. And EB5 got kicked down along with it. But Congress has said there will not be not only additional positive changes to the EB5 program, there will not be a renewal of the program at all if the industry doesn't get behind supporting reasonable legislation coming out of Congress that's going to improve the EB5 industry. I think that's very instructive on what we could find in crowdfunding. As crowdfunding expands, and again, we're frustrated at the slowness of it, but it's actually rather similar to the experience in EB5. Obviously differences, but in many ways, many similarities. So when crowdfunding starts to take off, you can bet the profile is going to be raised, and the bad guys are going to get caught, and the bad negative press is going to get out, and people are going to say, we've got to stop this, and there's going to be much the similar kind of an experience. The EB5 industry expects to weather the current storm and to take an industry that went like this and then flatlined back up to a growth profile. The crowdfunding is likely to go the same way, I believe, and if so, it may well encounter this same kind of, once it takes off, it may encounter this bump in the road unless, before it is able to then take off again, unless we're all so proactive, and I echo so many of the comments that earlier speakers have made, if we step in charge in front of things and make sure that we're perhaps following the EB5 model to the extent we can. Forget about the immigration stuff that doesn't apply, you know, but a lot of this stuff is the same old, same old. Let's follow that. If we can get out in front of this industry, we can avoid some of the headaches that EB5 has experienced and make this thing a program that grows without the stops and starts and the fits and struggles that EB5 has experienced, that all of which I think were avoidable. If we look at the example of EB5, we can follow and improve upon the experience of success in EB5 by avoiding the missteps in EB5. And when this thing takes off, it'll have a smooth glide upwards. I think that's highly possible. And I think I've probably run past my time.
No, it's good. You're good. Just we have one question, but you're going to be in there later on.
Right. I wanted to offer folks, if you have questions that
Did they
were...
raise it from 500 to 800?
Yes, well, not yet. The legislation currently coming out of the Senate and we're working on, we're with a group of securities lawyers who are negotiating on behalf of the industry just the integrity measures, because those are basically securities law focused. The current proposal coming out of Cornyn's office is to raise EB5 from a $500,000 minimum investment to an $800,000 minimum investment, but to cut the typical EB5 investment, which is an investment not made in an area of high unemployment, it's currently $1 million. They're talking about cutting that to $850,000. So the delta between the two is $800,000 to $850,000 instead of $500,000 or $1 million. The expectation is that's going to allow more projects to be financed in areas other than the big urban cores, which is where a majority of EB5 is being conducted. Yes, there's a chance for that. There is legislation that's been offered in the Senate to not count what are called the derivative green cards, which are the spouse and kids. That would mean you're talking about, even without changing the number above 10,000, you're talking about 10,000 investors, which would perhaps triple the number of investors without raising the 10,000. Or you could continue to include derivatives but triple it to 30,000, let's say. Or you could do both, which would be the industry nirvana. Well, I'll be available to, we have a Q&A panel later on in the afternoon.
Before you go, that if anybody, for audience at home, if they want to get in touch with you, how do they get to go? How do you find it?
Well, we're obviously we have a website, homeierlaw.com, not terribly creative idea. But we are there, and you can certainly reach me by email at michael@homeierlaw.com. And I look forward to speaking with you guys both about EB5 and also about how EB5 can show a good path for crowdfunding going forward.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks for listening.
Appreciate it. Thank you.